All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Mark Goodacre. Dr. Goodacre is professor of religious studies at Duke University, where he specializes in gospel studies and the Synoptic Problem, and he hosts the NT Pod, which explores questions relating to the Gospels and Christian origins. He is also the author of the brand new book, The Fourth Synoptic Problem, John's Knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, out now on Eerdmans, where he argues that John knew and used the synoptic narratives when composing his gospel. We will be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Goodacre, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, as I was telling you before the show, one of the best things about doing this podcast is I've gotten to meet a ton of scholars that have been very influential in my life, and I don't think that there is any other scholar that has impacted my reading of the Gospels more than you. I've been a huge fan of your NT pod. I'd highly recommend I have recommended it on the show before, but anyone who's listening to this, after you listen to this episode, go subscribe to that. It's incredible. So I'm really excited to talk to you today. But for my audience members that don't know who you are, tell us about yourself, your background, and your work.
Sure. I'm currently a professor of religious studies at Duke University. I specialize in Christian origins, New Testament, especially interested in how early Christian literature relates to one another, different works relate to one another. I've been in the US for 20 years. Before that, I was born and bred in the UK. And so you can pick that up from some of my cultural references, but also from my accent.
Yeah. So your new book, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, either just came out or it's going to be coming out soon, and it is in a lot of ways a summary of your kind of life's work on the Gospels, or maybe not a summary, but a climax of your life's work. So, what motivated you to write The Fourth Synoptic Gospel? Why this book? Why now?
Well, it kind of flowed naturally out of what I'd done in the past because I had no intention of writing a book on John's Gospel until relatively recently. But what happened was I'd written a book on Luke's use of Matthew. It's called The Case Against Q, and that came out 23 years ago. And when I wrote that book, a lot of people said to me, well, okay, so if Luke knows Matthew, what about the Gospel of Thomas? Does that know the Synoptic Gospels as well? Because at the time, a lot of people thought Thomas was independent. So I thought, well, let's have a look. Let's have a look and see. So I became fully persuaded that Thomas knew the Synoptic Gospels. So I wrote a book arguing that. And not long after that, I thought, do you know what? Some of the same principles that I felt I'd used in the Thomas book and in the Q book, some of those same principles I thought would actually make sense if I was looking at John's gospel as well. And so I just started looking through John and, is it, familiar with the Synoptic Gospels? And to me, the evidence was so overwhelming that John knew the Synoptics that I thought, yeah, I want to write about this as well. So that's really how it came. It was really, I mean, I joke in the book that it's the third part of a trilogy, but there was no intention to write a trilogy. This was just it piqued my interest, and so I had to go through with it.
Well, you are, I would say, probably the leading advocate of the, I don't know if we want to call it the anti-Q New Testament scholarship. I don't know how we want to phrase that camp, but I remember coming across your work when I was in Bible college 15 years or so or whatever, and just being completely convinced that Q didn't exist. And I had several scholars that contributed to the Next Quest for the Historical Jesus Project on my show last year, and you were one of the contributors of that too. And one of the things that they all had in common was that they were kind of thinking about ways of reading the gospel that didn't necessarily relate to Q. Now, that has been the dominant theory, and I've discussed it a little bit on the show, but you're really the guy that's driving a lot of this work. So I want to hear it from you. Maybe talk to us about what the Q problem is in relationship to the synoptic problem, and why you don't think Q is the correct solution.
Sure. I mean, for those not familiar with it, this problem is really straightforward. It's just that as well as lots of agreements between all three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you've got a ton of agreements between Matthew and Luke that aren't in Mark. And so if you've got, a whole batch of material that's in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark, you've got to say, well, there's three possibilities. Either Matthew knows Luke, Luke knows Matthew, or if neither of them knows the other one, then they must have got it from some kind of hypothetical document that's now lost. And the majority view for a long time has been that that's the right option, that they both copied not one from the other, but from this hypothetical document that got lost. So what do you call it? Well, the German word for source is Quelle, and so they use the first letter of that word, and Q's got a certain ring to it. And it became hugely popular because a lot of people thought it was implausible that Luke had used Matthew, and therefore Q, just moves into the foreground. But I've never been convinced by the Q hypothesis. It seems to me that Luke's knowledge of Matthew explains the evidence far better than the Q theory does, especially in places where Matthew and Luke are editing Markan material. It looks to me really clear that Luke has got Matthew as well as Mark. So I just wanted to argue the contrary position that there was never a Q, and that Luke was in fact familiar with Matthew. So that's really the gist of it. And in a nutshell, it's just an argument for I'm drawing a straight line from Matthew to Luke instead of these lines up to a hypothetical Q.
Yeah, and so in your analysis, the literary relationship between the gospels would begin with Mark. So you still believe in Mark in priority, and then go from
Absolutely.
from Mark to Matthew, and then from Matthew to Luke, and Luke to John,
Hmm.
correct?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
and you argue that Luke knows both Matthew and Mark.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, of course, one of the dangers of my literary model is that a lot of people think it's kind of too neat, and like history is often messy and isn't neat. But the difficulty with that is that sometimes your models need to be as straightforward as possible so that you can actually get a real sense of what's going on. Yes, history is messy, but that doesn't mean our models have to be messy. The more messy our models are, the less likely they are to correspond to the reality. But yes, that's basically the way I see it. It's like a kind of, it's what my friend James Barker talks about as snowballing. So you begin with Mark, Matthew improves on Mark, Luke attempts to improve on Matthew and Mark, and John attempts to supplement and improve on all three.
Yeah, and I had James Barker on the show last year to talk about his book on synoptic trajectories
Hmm.
too. And I just when you sit down and read them that way, it just makes so much sense of the evidence. And that's really a lot of what your book is about, kind of building on that work that has come before you and then connecting John to the synoptic gospels. Now, one of the things that you talk about in the early chapters of your book is that throughout Christian history, everyone pretty much just assumed that John knew the synoptics. That was like the default perspective, but all that
Hmm.
changed in the modern era. So I want you to explain that shift to my audience. Why is it that
Sure.
throughout most of Christian history, people just assumed, yeah, John obviously knew Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and when and why did that change?
Yeah, what I'm arguing is actually a very old-fashioned thing, quite a conservative position, something that most Christians have believed for most of history. But New Testament scholars are strange creatures, and they have a little they have a frequently, for good or evil, a kind of anti-ecclesial bias, and if the churches believe this, then they want to say this, and lots of the time that does produce good scholarship. But sometimes that anti-ecclesial bias can go a little bit too far, and I think this is one of those cases where so what happened really is in the middle of the 20th century, a scholar called C.H. Dodd, a British scholar, wrote a couple of very influential books on John's Gospel, where he modeled John's Gospel as something that was independent of the synoptics, but not independent of their tradition. So he appealed to oral tradition as the way of explaining the commonalities. And then he also appealed to oral tradition to explain the new stuff that was in John. And this was an era where many scholars were very, very excited about the role that oral tradition was playing in gospel origins. So you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, they also appeal to oral tradition all the time in that too. So it was a way of explaining John without having John showing any literary knowledge of the synoptics. And it kind of appealed as well to a scholarship that was seeing John's gospel as being produced in an independent community that was isolated from the rest of the world, like a sectarian community. And if you see John's gospel as coming from a community that's kind of sectarian, it's harder to imagine it having Matthew, Mark, and Luke as kind of foundation documents in that community. So you get the independent Johannine community and the independence from the synoptics. So you can read the gospel as the history of this isolated sectarian community. So that's really where that model just started getting very, very popular. Some people will say that it was actually a consensus in the second half of the 20th century. I don't quite believe in that, because you had several really important scholars that stood out from that supposed consensus. C.K. Barrett, for example, one of the greatest New Testament scholars to have lived, believed that and argued that John knew at least Mark and Luke. So I don't think it was ever quite a consensus, but it was certainly a majority view, certainly a model that many, many people worked with for a very long time.
Yeah, and in your book, obviously, it's called the Fourth Synoptic Gospel. So you're arguing for kind of the literary relationship between John and the Synoptics, and I want to spend the rest of the show really breaking down the mechanics of that. The
Sure.
the first time that I sat down and read the Gospels, I was like 14 years old, and I had a guy in my church say you just have to read them. Like you don't have a choice. You need to sit down and just
Hmm.
go through all four of them. And so I started with Matthew, and it's very obvious as you read through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, even as a 14-year-old, oh, like these are very similar. There's a lot of overlap here. And then you get to John and you feel like you're in an entirely different world. So,
Yeah.
just from the standpoint of an aesthetic reading of the Gospels, there are a lot of differences. And you address, I think, a problem that a lot of people identify with John, and that's that there's not a lot of verbal agreement, or there's not a lot of apparent verbal agreement between John and the Synoptics. And so you kind of deal with this question in your book of, well, how much verbal agreement should we actually expect between these
Hmm.
various Gospels? So break that problem down to us, like on a verbal level, on the level of words. How
Sure.
much in common should we expect these Gospels to have with each other?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that is the key question, really, because I think a lot of people, when they read John, they read it like, did you read it like Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, then
Yeah,
John when you were a
yeah, straight
teenager?
through.
Because yeah, I did the same thing. I did the same thing. I read it in that canonical order. And when you read it like that, you get to John and you're just struck by what I call this, like, it's like a firewall
Yeah,
between the Synoptics and John. It's just so different. And I think that it's just so different is one of the things that drives this idea that John is independent. But the thing is, you don't diagnose one work's knowledge of another's work by looking at the differences. You diagnose it by looking at what's similar. So the question then is exactly what you say. I mean, how much similarity should you expect? And the thing is, we're spoiled by the synoptics. There's so much verbatim agreement among Matthew, Mark, and Luke that we kind of expect John to do the same thing, and he doesn't. It's nowhere near as close to any one of those gospels as they are to each other. So one of the things I think you have to do is you have to reset. When you go to John's gospel, you then have to say, hold on a minute. Is it the case that what Matthew, Mark, and Luke do is typical of people in the ancient world? And it's not. It really isn't typical. It's actually quite unusual. It's very, very high verbatim agreement. What John does is much more normal in the ancient world. There's some verbatim agreement, but what he does is he paraphrases his source material. So that's one of the things I actually want to sort of make clear in the book, that we've been expecting to see too much agreement because we are so familiar with the synoptics.
yeah, and I think that you address this too immediately after that in the book, that the way that, especially for people that hold the Q theory, the way that they talk about Matthew and Luke's relationship to Mark and Q is through the rubric of dependence. So it's like it's the
Hmm.
idea that, like, Matthew and Luke, they depended on these two sources, and without them, they wouldn't have been able to come into existence at all. But you argue that the concept of dependence here might be flawed, and the words that you would like to replace with
Hmm.
that are the acknowledge, use, familiarity. You say that these are
Hmm.
better terms for describing the relationship between these gospels. So why is that significance? Why is that significant? And why has the language of dependence maybe led us down some false trails?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. Because this is something I argued in my Thomas book as well. I noticed that whenever people that argued for Thomas's independence argued, they always talked about Thomas, as it being impossible that Thomas was dependent on the synoptics, as if the two choices are independent or
Right.
dependent. And the thing is, that sounds logical, but it's actually not, because independence means no contact whatsoever with the work. And you can be familiar with the work, you can know the work, you can use the work, you can presuppose it and all the rest of it without being dependent on it. So I decided that one of the problems was this word dependence. I think it just puts one in a kind of like a client relationship with the other. So yes, I like much better language of familiarity, knowledge, and so on. I even do that where I can with the synoptics, just to sort of take out that idea, of a complete and total dependence on the other thing. So yeah, I think that's right. I think that's helpful language.
Yeah, and you already referenced the Johannine firewall, kind of this idea that there's this barrier between the Synoptic Gospels and John. Just and a lot of it again is just it comes down to aesthetics. It just seems so different. And I remember too I think the first monograph on the Gospels I ever read was N.T. Wright's Jesus and the Victory of God. And
Right.
and even in that book, like he doesn't draw on John very much. And so you kind of
No.
like for like an undergraduate student, that's where I was when I was read it, you walk away with the impression like, oh, if you want to know about Jesus, you got to read the Synoptics. John's kind of doing something else.
Mhm.
And this comes from like a very conservative New Testament scholar. But you talk in your book how in scholarship and in the classrooms, there is just kind of this hard division between John
Mhm.
so and the Synoptics. So how has that contributed to this kind of popular conception that there is this radical break between John and the
Right.
Synoptics?
Yeah, yeah. It's fun. It's funny you mention Tom Wright. I mean, when I was kind of a student of his as an undergraduate. When I say that, I mean he wasn't my advisor or anything, but I used to go along to his lectures and he was a brilliant lecturer. This is right at the beginning of his career, so he wasn't very well known at the time. But he did a series of lectures on the historical Jesus, and in his lectures on the historical Jesus, he barely referenced John at
Yeah.
all. And so even though he sometimes gets accused of canonical bias, actually it's a kind of synoptic bias, if anything. So so that is a good example. I actually asked him one time whether he was ever going to get to John, and he said he thought he was saving John up for his retirement. So um, but yeah, that we do as we walk through the synoptics get so familiar with synoptic territory that then yeah we open John's gospel and we see in the beginning was the word and the word. I mean, you just in this different kind of cosmos. But for all of that, though, even though you do have this sudden radical change of gear, you get to the end of the prologue, you get to 1 verse 19, and we go straight into John the Baptist's preaching. And what does he say? He says, I'm a voice crying in the wilderness, which is in all three synoptics. He says that that there's one coming after me, he says, and I don't want to, and I can't untie the thong of his sandals, which you find verbatim in Mark and Luke. So in spite of all of that massive difference, when you open up John chapter 1, you're then suddenly on very familiar synoptic territory. It's like, I recognize this guy. I recognize the way he talks. And then you get a call of the disciples, and all right, there are some interesting variations. Nathaniel is on the scene. Andrew seems to be a more major character. James and John are played down and not even mentioned by name. So you have these differences, but it's still recognizably the call of the disciples. So you just walk in this familiar territory, even though we have just passed through what seems to be that firewall.
Yeah, and that's one of the first points that you make as you begin to build your case for John's use of the synoptics, and that's that like John's narrative as a whole does actually, in a very broad sense, follow the synoptics. Now, people will immediately point to John chapter 2 and say, "Well, you have the temple cleansing scene; it's at the very beginning.
Yeah.
So how can that be?" So walk us through that claim. How, in a very broad sense, does John actually follow the narrative arc of the synoptic gospels?
Well, it's kind of. I think John's gospel is people that think he doesn't know the synoptics. They're missing one of the elements of his literary genius, which is that you tell the reader of the synoptics that they're on familiar territory in chapter 1, as I said, with John the Baptist, with the call of the disciples. But then as we go into chapter 2, we have the first sign. It's the wedding at Cana, which is not found in the synoptic gospels, but the imagery of Jesus as the bridegroom, the imagery of the gospel as being new wine and new wine for new wineskins is already there. So you feel like, even though this is strange and unusual and new, you kind of feel like it rings true. Same thing then, you go to the cleansing of the temple after the wedding at Cana, and you think, wow, what's this doing here? But it's a familiar story. And you even get within that story reference to Jesus's resurrection, which kind of hints that this has been displaced from its synoptic position. And then you go into chapter 3, where we have Jesus talking to Nicodemus, and you get three references, the only three references in the whole gospel, to the kingdom of God. So again, put the synoptic reader at their ease. Kingdom of God, that's the terminology they know. But then you move gradually towards the terminology of eternal life in John 3:16, the most famous verse in the gospel. And after you get that in John 3:16, eternal life is the word that we use throughout the gospel. So it's carefully crafted, this gospel is, I think, in order to put the reader of the synoptics at their ease, but say at the same time, this is something new.
Yeah, and the next point that you make in your book too, which this was a huge game changer for me. I'd never thought about it this way, but even on the traditional reading of the synoptic problem, all right, if you take it that Matthew and Luke were both redacting Mark, they both knew Mark, and they were kind of
Mhm.
working with his material as they crafted their own gospels. All right, that's been a very commonplace position in New Testament scholarship for a very long time, well established position. But in your book, you argue that there are many places in John where he seems to be familiar with the way that Matthew and Luke redact Mark, that he knows about like he understands the edits that they've made to Mark's original. So I want you to explain to my audience, how can we tell from John that he's familiar with the way that Matthew and Luke have kind of reworked Mark?
Well, it's something that I'm surprised that more scholars haven't noticed this. It's out there in the scholarship. Not all of the examples. I think a couple of the examples are new and unique to me, but at least I haven't found them in the literature. But lots of them I've pulled from other people that have made similar points. And what happens is that where you get really sometimes quite minor differences between Matthew and Mark and between Luke and Mark, John will carry over that minor difference. And the reason why I stress minor is that if there were big differences, you'll get our old friend oral tradition appealed to again. But sometimes what we're doing is we're looking at Matthew just rephrasing bits of Mark. The story of the crown of thorns. There's no new substance in Matthew's story where he talks about the crown of thorns being put on Jesus's head. He's just rephrasing Mark, as Matthew often does. And then amazingly, John takes over Matthew's rephrasing of Mark. And I mean, one of my favorite examples, which has been pointed out in the literature before, although frequently not noticed as an element of Luke's redaction, is that in Luke 22, he says that Satan entered into Judas Iscariot, which has a parallel in John 13, Satan entering into Judas Iscariot. Lots of people have pointed out that link, and even people that think that Luke knew no John point out that link. But when I looked at that link, I knew, because I've spent so much time looking at Luke's gospel over the years and its differences from the others, that Luke likes the word Satan. Like that's his word for the devil. John only uses it there. John uses different words for the devil, including in context where he's talking about Judas. Twice he talks about Judas being a devil, using the word diabolos. So why is he suddenly switched to Satan in this context? And it seems to me it's obvious it's because he's got his eye on Luke's gospel as well as on Mark and Matthew. So there are lots of little cases like that where these look like literary embellishments, literary rewritings of Mark by Matthew and Luke, which amazingly enough turn up in John. And I mean, I could have been exhaustive in this book, but the problem about trying to be exhaustive is that it's exhausting for the reader. So what I did instead is I took a risk and I just chose my top 10 favorite examples, 5 from Matthew and 5 from Luke.
Yeah, well, I think that is very efficient too, because like I said, some of these books on gospel scholarships they can be a little unmanageable to that extent, like where they're
Yeah.
300, 400 pages long. It's very technical, but I think you do a very good job of breaking this down in a way that anyone who's familiar with this could easily understand. And I thought that argument was really powerful in your book. And we've already talked about the way that John understood kind of the broad contours of the synoptic story, but you also argue in your book that John kind of, in a lot of ways, he presupposes that his audience was familiar with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Like as he's writing this, he
Mhm.
seems to know that whoever his intended audience might be, they are familiar with the synoptic gospel. So I have two questions about that. The
Sure.
first is, how can we tell? And I'm sure that some of the examples you used earlier are probably relevant here as well. And then does this tell us anything about like the purpose for John writing his gospel? Does this shine any light on, all right, if there's already these three gospels, and John knows them and somewhat approves of them, why would he feel the need to write this fourth gospel that is that's slightly different from the first three?
Yeah, I mean, I think this argument is relatively new. The idea that John John's use of the synoptics can be illustrated by places where he's presupposing narratives that he's not narrated. I should say pretty much all of the examples that I use are ones that have been people have drawn attention to. Oh, I wonder if he's presupposing a synoptic story here or a synoptic-like story. So people have made those observations, but I don't think anyone before has developed it into an argument that John knows all three synoptics. If they have, it's not something that I've particularly noticed. And it's just cases where if you read John as independent of the synoptics, his narrative doesn't work so well because he's alluding to things that the reader knows nothing about if you're independent of the synoptics. So, to take one of the obvious ones, John 3:24, he points out that John the Baptist hadn't been arrested yet. And the reason why he's saying this is because John is appearing pretty much alongside Jesus in the narrative. Now, that makes no sense at all if you're reading John in isolation, because you go, well, I don't know when John was arrested. I mean, but if you're reading it alongside and in fact, if you're a first century reader that didn't know the synoptics, when Josephus, the Jewish historian, references John's arrest, he actually tells that story quite late on, around about 36 CE. So you would have no problem at all thinking that John the Baptist was a contemporary of Jesus, maybe even came after Jesus. So the only reason it becomes an issue is because of the way that the synoptics tell the story, which is you get John's preaching, then he gets arrested, and then Jesus' ministry starts. And John's basically kind of correcting that, but adds that corrective note there. So if John's independent, his gospel is kind of very odd in that respect. But if he expects his readers to know the synoptics, it makes sense. And the same is true on multiple other occasions, I think. I mean, I don't know if the author of the fourth gospel even noticed all of these, but I mean, some of them are just I think are really telling. I mean, one that I particularly like is in the arrest story where Jesus says to Peter, who's just tried to chop the high priest slave's ear off, called Malchus in John, he says, "Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given to me?" Now, I've read and heard that line many times over the years without thinking, well, hold on a minute. Is it normal for John to talk about the cup? And it's not. The cup as an image for Jesus' suffering is something that's synoptic. And it's specifically and famously associated with the Gethsemane story, where Jesus prays to his Father, take this cup away from me. So if you read the arrest story in John and presuppose Gethsemane, it makes sense because Jesus has come to a resolution that he must drink this cup the Father has given to him. So that line in John provides a response to something that he's not actually narrated, but which the synoptics have narrated. So I found that kind of striking. I still worry that there's a whole bunch more presuppositions in John's gospel that I haven't been able to spot. I read and reread and reread, and actually, even I did a couple of them quite late on because I'd missed them. Because we, in our minds, are so synoptic focused, or at least I am, that it's easy not to notice that John hasn't narrated something that he then takes for granted in his narrative.
Yeah, because you just know it exactly like John's intended
Exactly.
audience.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the other things that I really appreciated about your work, and I know that in the past you've gotten some pushback from other New Testament scholars for this, is that you appeal to, especially when you talk about the way that the synoptic authors utilized each other as a source. You oftentimes appeal to the way that like lives of Jesus are portrayed in art and movies and TV shows in
Hmm.
the modern era. So you draw a comparison
Hmm.
between the way that a lot of these programs are kind of patched together, and the same way that the synoptic authors do. I think that maybe before I ask you my next question, I'd love for you to comment on that. What can we learn about, like, The Chosen is a very good example of this. I've only seen a
Hmm.
little bit of it, but pretty much all of my friends and family members have seen a lot of it and loved it. And from what little bit I've seen of it, they're not just following one of the four gospels, right? It's
Right.
mixed. So talk to us
Yeah.
about how modern reinterpretations of the gospels can actually shine light on this problem.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've seen all 5 seasons of The Chosen. Some of it even in the movie theater, and
No.
some of the episodes I've seen more than once, because I teach a class on Jesus in film. And I do think that more scholars should pay more attention to the way that the Gospels are adapted in fiction and film, because it actually helps the process of historical imagination, even where the films aren't great. And the pushback that I've had in the past where I've done this is people will say, well, Goodacre doesn't seem to realize that Luke is not a 20th century filmmaker. No, Goodacre knows that perfectly well. That's why I'm appealing to the films. I'm appealing to them because they actually help us in our contemporary space to look at the way that the gospel is being adapted, and then to ask the question, how might it have been similar or different in antiquity? So, yeah, I find that a very useful way of reflecting on things. And one insight I had for this book did come out of watching Jesus films, which is that, I mean, Jesus of Nazareth, Franco Zeffirelli from 1977, I kept noticing how lines that the narrator had written in the Gospels were actually moving into Jesus's and others' direct speech in Jesus of Nazareth. And of course, you have to do that in drama because you don't really want to have a very prominent narrator. And I then noticed that the same thing happens in John's Gospel with respect to the Synoptics, that quite often the narrator's words from Matthew, Mark, or Luke go into the characters' statements in John. In fact, I already mentioned one of them, which is the voice crying in the wilderness. So that's in the narrator's voice in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. In John's Gospel, it's in John the Baptist's own mouth. I am a voice crying in the wilderness. So John is easier to adapt in films than the synoptics are because so much of the dialogue is actually already in the characters' mouths. So that was one thing where I think that knowledge of fiction and film had helped.
And this leads me directly to the next question. So you argue that in a lot of ways, John is a dramatic reworking of the synoptics. And by dramatic,
Hmm.
I don't mean like radical or cataclysmic. I mean like
Hmm.
he's taking the synoptics and turning them into a drama. That's what he's
Yeah.
attempting to do. So again, kind of two questions that follow up with that. Where do we see this at work in John's gospel? Him transforming the synoptic material into drama. And again, what does this say about John's intentions and about what he's trying to communicate to his audience? Like, why would he take these synoptic narratives and turn them into a more dramatic presentation of Jesus?
I mean, I did quite like the potential double meaning of
Yeah.
dramatic. I mean, I do, as you point out, I do mean dramatic in the sense of moving it into the dramatic mode, character voices, and so on. But I kind of liked the secondary meaning of a radical transformation because John is that as well. But yeah, the chapter's about drama. I did worry about it in some ways because I know that the pushback on that would be a lot of people will say, well, look, John isn't a drama. It's not a play. It is a first century or second century life of Jesus. It's a literary piece. It does have a prominent narrator as well as lots of character interaction. But one of the things that you find in lots and lots of ancient works is that even if you're writing something like a bios, a life of someone, you can still move in the dramatic mode. You can have more and less dramatic elements. And there have been quite a few excellent books over the years that actually look at how John uses the dramatic mode in the way that he presents his narratives. What there hasn't been so much on is looking at how John moving in the dramatic mode affects the way he uses the synoptics. So that's the sort of the new bit of that. And it's a fairly simple observation. It's things like in Mark 6, the narrator says, at the feeding of the 5,000, they all ate and were satisfied. And that's actually that's a favorite word of Mark's, being satisfied, kortazo in the Greek. And John 6, Jesus says it. He says, you all ate and were satisfied. And it's the only time John uses that word for satisfied. So it's just little things like that where the narrator's voice morphs into character speech and it creates a kind of a much more lively sort of narrative. And I think John does it much more than has been realized. So I'll be interested to see what the reception of that chapter is like because although it's popular to see John as drama, Lou Martin famously talks about John as a drama on two levels. It's not been really much explored at all to see how looking at the dramatic mode could help you to see John's use of the synoptics.
Yeah, and do you think that that accounts for the reason why maybe John feels a little bit like darker and more brooding than the synoptic gospels? That that was kind of an intentional effect of the way that he was working with the synoptics?
Yeah, he's just less pithy. I mean, Jesus in the synoptics, especially in Mark, he likes one-liners. You know,
Yeah.
he likes to say things like, "The Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath." Oh gosh, I've suddenly gone old-fashioned. Humanity is not made. Oh my goodness, I can't do it now. The Sabbath is made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. I'm gonna say it's a memorable one-liner, which I just messed
Right.
up. But anyway, it's a one-liner. It's harder for a rich person to go through the eye of a needle. No, it's not. It's harder for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Great one-liners, and you get them in Matthew and Luke as well. But John is more than just one-liners. John is about ponderous. No, I don't want to say ponderous. That sounds rude. It's about lengthy discourses which give Jesus in the gospel time to explore. His own nature, the nature of the world as he sees it, light and life and witness and so on. So yeah, I think that is one of the reasons for the difference, that Jesus's voice just becomes so much more prominent front and center in the fourth gospel.
Yeah, and that's why really you get I mean Jesus is just a much more rich character in John's gospel. And I know that that's one of the reasons why people would say that John, oh, he doesn't know the synoptics because Jesus just he looks and feels like a different person in John. But if you look at it from the perspective that you articulate in the book as it's kind of a dramatic recasting of the synoptics, it doesn't mean that there's no differences there, because there certainly are aesthetically, but there's a lot more overlap than people would generally give John credit for.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
So this is going to lead us to another very complicated question in Johannine studies, and that is of the identity of the beloved disciple. And there have been debates about this; they've been raging for years and years and years. But you actually have a really interesting take on this. So, if John was very much influenced by the Synoptics, what does that do for our understanding of the identity of the beloved disciple?
Well, it was strange to me beginning to work on this because I did think for a while, I'll surely not have anything fresh to say about the beloved disciple in this book because, reams have been written about this character. But then as I started reading all the literature on the beloved disciple, I was amazed by the extent to which people were not reading this character with a knowledge of the synoptic gospels in the background. Even to the point where you'll get some scholars saying, well, we have to get the synoptics out of our head so that we can read John's character of the beloved disciple more clearly. And I thought, no, that's absolutely wrong. That's the wrong way to do it because for centuries, people have been reading John in the light of the synoptics. And by this point in the book, I have been attempting to argue that John knows the synoptics. So, just as a thought experiment, what does the beloved disciple character sound like if you've read the synoptics? And I think he sounds very much like a member of the 12 who sits down with Jesus at the Last Supper and who is someone that's very much in Jesus's inner circle and who therefore is probably based on a character like John, son of Zebedee, an idealized version of him, yes, but based on that character. And it means that all these other potential candidates for the beloved disciple don't really work. And that's why John's gospel is called John's gospel, because people did read the beloved disciple as being John. I think it's actually, and I think the author invites you to do that, but it's an argument that only really works against the background of having read the synoptic gospels. So that's why it's called the beloved disciple for readers of the synoptics.
I mean, is it a historical possibility that John actually wrote the Gospel of John, or is it just it's impossible for us to know with any certainty?
I'm pretty sure that John son of Zebedee, the historical John son of Zebedee, didn't write the gospel and wasn't even a kind of key figure in the formation of the gospel. I mean, Luke Luke describes him as being agrammatos without letters in Acts of the Apostles. The idea though, but the thing is, a lot of people take that view and then they say, "Oh, therefore the beloved disciple can't be John son of Zebedee," but that's an illegitimate move. The question I think we should asking is, could it be that this beloved disciple character is based on someone like John, son of Zebedee? And I think the answer then is yes. He's just so conspicuous by his absence. I mean, if you say the beloved disciple is Thomas or Nathaniel or Mary Magdalene, these characters are all named characters in the fourth gospel. But if you've read the Synoptics, you go, "Where's John? Where's John?" You know, I mean, at the Last Supper in Luke's gospel, Peter and John are the guys that go and prepare the Passover for Jesus. And then in John's gospel, you open up chapter 13, we're at the Last Supper, we have Peter and the beloved disciple next to him. So it's a pretty natural inference if you've read the Synoptics. So yeah, I think based on a historical character, but a kind of idealized version of that character.
And here's an issue that I don't think you address this directly in the book, but if you like any introduction to any scholarly introduction to the Gospels will have to inevitably deal with, well, when were these Gospels written? What were the dates? And I've seen John ranges everywhere from like, oh, he was is right after the fall of Jerusalem all the way into like the middle of the first century. There's a
Right.
wide range of speculation about when he was written. Does this help us? Not that we're ever going to be able to nail it down precisely, but does this help maybe shrink the window within which we think John could be written? Is there anything that your argument in the book does for our understanding of the like the potential date of John's composition?
Yeah, yeah. There are some things that help. It's funny you bring this up. I actually, in an earlier version of the book, had planned a whole chapter on the date of the gospel, and the problem is I haven't got enough fresh to say about it that it was worth it. I wrote a chapter on the dating of the Gospel of Thomas, and I in my Thomas book, and I thought I actually don't have a lot to add to that, and I didn't want to repeat a lot of stuff that I'd said there. But the one thing I think that helps us is that if I'm right that John knew all three synoptics, obviously he has to post date them.
Right.
So we've got a kind of gospel sequence: Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, and there are one or two other things that do help us narrow the window. If you think that the synoptic gospels are all written after the Jewish war and the destruction of Jerusalem, which I do, then that places them post 70. And so that's the kind of earliest point at which any of them could have been written. I also feel that on the other end, Ignatius in the early to middle second century shows clear knowledge of Matthew and of Luke, in my opinion. Now that means that that pushes us in the other direction as well. So the earliest we've got for the Gospels has to be the early 70s, and the latest really has to be around, I don't know, 120s, something like that. So we've got a kind of 50-year period where we can actually locate Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, and I'm comfortable with that level of vagueness. I think the one other hint is Josephus does well, it looks like Luke knows the Jewish historian Josephus, who's writing the Antiquities in the 90s, and if that's right, then John can't be any earlier than the 90s if John's using Luke. So I think that's telling as well.
Oh, I think that's really, really helpful. I think the last major issue before I just ask you some general questions about the impact of this book has to do with Christology, and
Mhm.
this has been, I mean, not only in I guess popular discourse, but in scholarship too. This is where it seems like John has been presented as in the greatest, starkest contrast against the Synoptic Gospels. And at least in academic circles, it's been that well, John has a very high Christology, and the Synoptic Gospels
Mhm.
do not. And in churches, I've grown up in churches my entire life. I've just tended to notice that preachers love to favor the Gospel of John, and
Yeah.
Christian theologians love to favor the Gospel of
Yeah,
John
yeah.
at the expense of the Synoptics sometimes. And a lot of the times when you hear a reading from the Gospels in church, it's not coming from Matthew, Mark, or Luke, which I think is a shame for multiple reasons. But in,
Mhm.
in James Barker's book that we talked about earlier, he has, I don't remember if it's a full chapter or if it's just a section, but he talks about in terms of like gospel trajectories, how we can start to think about John's Christology in relationship to this the Synoptics. And you talk about this in your book as well, that there actually is kind of a Christological continuity between between John and the Synoptics, and that maybe John's Christology is not actually fundamentally different from the Synoptics. So this is a huge theological issue. It's really, really important. I just want you to walk us through that whole section in your book.
Mhm.
How do we account for, well, is there a continuity between John and the Synoptics in terms of their Christology, and like what does that mean about their relationship?
Yeah, I think we've drastically overestimated John's difference from the Synoptics when it comes to Christology. It's easy to see why. The Gospel begins with this extraordinary statement of the Logos, the Word, becoming flesh. And there's nothing quite like that in the Synoptics, and it dazzles us.
Yeah.
And then we're looking for other similar high Christological claims in the Gospel. And then we get the I am sayings. There's nothing quite like those in the Synoptics either. There's certainly no I am the bread of life, I am the true vine, and so on. So those things dazzle us to the extent that we then don't notice that John's Christology is fundamentally grounded in the same concepts as you find in the Synoptics. And this isn't something that is difficult to dig out. I always say to my students that when you get one of these questions, like, why did Paul write the epistle to the Romans, or why did John write his gospel? See if the author gives you the answer. And in the fourth gospel, the author actually tells you why he's written the book. In 20, 30, and 31, he says, well, look, these signs have been written. I've written about these ones in order that you may know that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing in him, you might have life in his name. So when you get to the climactic point of the gospel, he doesn't say word became flesh or I am anything. What he actually draws attention to is Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, is as synoptic a Christological thing as you could get, especially that pairing. That pairing comes twice in Matthew's gospel. And in fact, if you look at a pivotal point in John's gospel as well, in chapter 11, Martha, roughly at the halfway point of the gospel, says to Jesus, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And that's like an 8-word verbatim agreement with Matthew, where Matthew has the same thing being said by Peter. So I think there's a fundamental Christological continuity that people have, broadly speaking, missed. I mean, I'm not saying that people don't know that stuff's
Right.
there. Obviously, they do. But I think they choose to focus on other things at the expense of these really, really important similarities between John and the Synoptics.
Well, and I suppose if your presupposition is that going back to the Johannine firewall metaphor, if you believe that there is a hard division between John and the Synoptics, well, then of course that would affect the way that you read John's Christology.
That's right, yeah. And I mean, I must admit, I've done it with myself for years.
Yeah.
And whenever I teach John, I always say, well, look, Jesus sounds different in John's gospel. He goes around saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I am the true vine. But then one day I was out for a walk and I was thinking about all of these images that Jesus uses in the I am sayings. And I thought, hold on a minute. And I just ran through them all in my mind. And I thought, bread of life, light of the world, good shepherd, true vine, and so on. Every single one of them uses imagery that we find in the
Yeah.
synoptics. And then that was like you know, quite powerful. I mean, like Jesus sits down at the Last Supper in the synoptics and he says, how much I've longed to drink of the fruit of the vine, and talks about how he won't be able to drink it again till he drinks it fresh in the kingdom of God. And they're in exactly the same setting in John's gospel. I am the true vine. It's really not that different, a statement. And then you could look, I mean, you could do this with each one. I mean, I'll do one more. Bread of life in John 6. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Right where we're actually just after the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the sea. And both of those are synoptic, the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the sea. In the walking on the sea in Mark's gospel, Jesus says, I am. There's no bit after that, but he says, I am, which is carried over into John. And then the next thing in John, he says, I am the bread of life, in a context where we're talking about bread and life giving bread. So, and actually, for what it's worth, the next couple of chapters of Mark also have lots of stuff about bread. So
Yeah.
it's too much. I don't believe in multiple coincidences. After a while, you have to say John knows the Synoptic Gospels.
And this is going to lead me to I guess my second to last question here. Um, this work that you do is obviously not you can't contain gospel scholarship. Like whatever conclusions you make about the literary relationship between the four gospels has to have an impact on the way that you understand early Christianity and its development and its theology, the really key formative years of the Christian faith. And so the insights that you have in this book, how might they, and I know this is a huge question that I'm dropping on you, but how can the insights in your book help us better understand early Christianity?
Well, I think one of the things that I can't help reflecting on is that the history of early Christianity or the early Jesus movement turns out to be slightly simpler than we thought it was. We had thought that everybody was working in their own distinct, isolated communities with conflicting theologies and Christologies, and there's this just kind of great melting pot. Actually, it turns out that Mark actually is inspirational for Matthew. He likes Mark enough that he wants to copy out whole parts of it. Luke likes Mark to a similar degree, if not more so, but wants to supplement it with that material from Matthew. And John wants to take their project further, but do different things with it. But it does seem like they're not all at loggerheads. We're not actually looking at a bunch of different sectarian communities, each carving out their own unique theology. Yes, of course, there are big differences. I'm not going to play those down in any way at all. But I think we've spent so long talking about the differences, maybe because we try to map our own very divergent Christianity onto the first century,
Right.
that we actually miss these really interesting commonalities and themes that you can just walk through. I mean, let's just take that one. Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. All four canonical gospels believe that. The epistles of Paul believe that. The Revelation of John believes that. Hebrews believes that, and I could go on. It's core. It's core material. And I know some people say that's because these are canonical books, and they're chosen by the winners. Obviously, there's some truth in that, but equally, we have to say that the earliest Jesus movement does seem to have these same core beliefs about who Jesus is.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. That leads me very naturally to my last question, and that is that all of these issues are extremely complicated, and it can almost be overwhelming for someone who is not initiated to gospel scholarship to even know where to begin. And again, that's like the reason why, like when I was an undergrad and right after I graduated, I mean, I listened to your because I really loved the Synoptic Problem, and I loved your solution to it. That's why I listened to several of your episodes two, three, four, 5 times because I feel like I just had to listen to them over and over again so that I could even understand what you were talking about sometimes, right? So these are really complicated, and there are a lot of good books out there, but not all of them are for people that are interested in the Bible and familiar with the Bible, and maybe even interested in biblical studies, but that aren't biblical scholars, right? Like it's kind of hard to find your way in.
Mhm.
You've been studying and writing about this for a long time now. What are some resources that you would recommend to people who are really interested in this issue, but just don't know where to begin?
I mean, I think one of the most fun things to, especially with the synoptic problem, just to embrace and get into these similarities and differences for yourself, is to get a gospel synopsis, which is one of these books which lays out the gospels in columns. There's a very good, and let's say if you haven't got Greek, probably one of the best is Throckmorton wrote a really great gospel synopsis. But the slightly more technical one is the one by Kurt Aland. And one of the fun things about Kurt Aland's synopsis is he actually pulls in all of those Johannine parallels.
Mhm.
So it makes it much easier to see where John is agreeing with the synoptics as well. He's done it in Greek and in English, and in Greek and English. So you can choose between any of those three. So they're definitely one of the places to really dig in yourself. And aside from that, there's just no substitute for just reading the Gospels all the way through. Just reading them, sometimes in one sitting as well. And in terms of other resources, I would say that if you're completely new to this stuff, the new edition of Bart Ehrman's Historical Introduction to the New Testament, which is co-written now with Hugo Mendez, is a really great place to start. It's actually the eighth edition of the book, but it's the first one that brings in a new co-author, which is Hugo Mendez. And a book we mentioned earlier on, actually, I've got it on my desk here, James Barker's Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, is really accessible in its way of explaining how he thinks the gospels are interrelated, and he even does some practicals in there. Talks about, you know, um, how to make a scroll, how to make a wax tablet, and it gets your imagination going on the actual process. So, I mean, they're probably some good places to begin.
And for people that are listening, I'll put all this in the show notes. And I did interview James Barker last year. For those of you guys that didn't catch it, I'll make sure that I put that in the description below. So make sure you check that out. Dr. Mark Goodacre, it has been incredible to talk with you today. The book is The Fourth Synoptic Problem, John's Knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Highly recommend it to everybody who's listening and is interested in these issues. Before I let you go today, you've published a lot. You have a podcast. Just talk to people about where they can find you and find your work.
Well, luckily, I've got an unusual name. So if you Google for Mark Goodacre, you will actually find your way to my homepage, which is actually at markgoodacre.org. But if you like this kind of setup, I do have a YouTube channel. I've recorded a lot of video shorts that deal with this kind of material and some longer form episodes as well. And that you just find that by going to YouTube and looking for Mark Goodacre's channel.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Goodacre, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.